And at this moment, you're probably thinking the video title said Marshall. We're going to get the Marshall up in just a minute. I just had this Blues Junior that had some rushing water noises when it first powered on yesterday. And it's been sitting overnight. I want to make sure that it does not still have that problem before I button it up and call it done. Just a little bit. So I will do this again after it's totally cooled off with each preamp tube pulled in sequence until I can narrow it down to either the preamp tube that's causing that noise when first powered on or to some component in that triode's particular circuit. We put this away and get the Marshall on the bench. All right, this is a 86 or 87, I believe, 2210. As you can tell, I've already got some caps up on one end so I could read the values just in case there was no change in the circuit, not reflected in the schematic. And in fact, let's see if I can show you this. It's a little bit tricky to pull this up. There were some added caps down here, not on the schematic. There was a delay getting some parts, so they are finally all here. So I'm gonna get started. And before we get to the main filter caps, I'm gonna do all these little electrolytics. I'll show you a little bit of the process. I'll probably show you what I do on this large one because it'll be more visible. You know, we'll stipulate that that's the same for every one of these, so it's not an hour-long video. So what I want to do is remove the old solder from this side without damaging those pads at all. So I reach around, I'm gonna push this cap lead through. I'll get my fingers on it. And same for here. Snip that little J-hook, that little hooked area off here, because if I pull it through, it'll just destroy that trace. This one should just pull out from this side. All right. And the cap pulls out from the other side. The originals are 3.3K, 3300 microfarad, 6.3 volt. I'll show you the new cap in just a moment. First, I want to get that old solder off. And yeah, the automated solder suckers can be good, though you still have to clean the tips quite a bit. And desoldering pumps, the handheld ones, you have to you declog them every 10 minutes or so. And there can be a shock when you use those. They can hit the board, which can be problematic for some components. It will often bend a pot lug, for instance. So I find that most of the time, the desoldering braid works really well, and I'm not declogging things, and it's very gentle and controllable. It's very nice stuff. It's for people who ask. It is Tech Spray Blue number 4, no clean. It's about $8 a roll of this stuff. Worth every penny. The cap that's going in there is this Vishay. It's a very nice, high quality cap. Probably much better specs than the original. It is 3300 microfarad. It is a 16 volt cap rather than the 6.3 volt cap. When in doubt, go a little bit higher. It's just physically a bit longer than the original. In this case, it won't matter. And when I put the new one in, I like to have the value visible so the next tech knows what I was doing. Let me stand on my head and get it lined up. Positive to positive. That's really important if you don't know. Now you do. And because the leads of this new cap, because the body of this cap is just a little bit longer, because there are no high quality 6.3 volt axial caps. 16 volts is about as low as you're going to get these days for anything worth having. I'm going to put a little bit of silicone underneath it because these leads won't be able to get it all the way to the board. Float a little bit heavier than I expected. That'll actually be good in this case. Just trying to make those leads say, okay, that's where you want me to go. I want to crimp those leads over before soldering. So there's a good mechanical support. Then I trim the excess leaving a hook, leaving that bend before soldering. So when I snip the lead, it doesn't shock the new solder joint, and I have less metal to heat up, so I can work faster, and the solder will set faster without any chance of the longer lead vibrating and causing a less than shiny solder joint. So that is a well-changed out cap with no damage to the traces. I'll do all the other caps in here next the same way, and we'll check right back. Okay, I got these changed out here on the foot switch jack. In a little while, after I do the rest of the filter caps, this DI output level and the pot and the jack were going to get replaced. That was a bad previous repair. Down here, the new components are in place. Pretty much looks factory, aside from my solder joints being a little bit shinier, but you know, I'd rather be shiny. Those of you with kids will not have that song stuck in your head for several hours, or those of you who are Flight of the Conchords fans, or just like a good Bowie pastiche. Top side view. Pretty blue caps. Like a blue LED. Makes it sound better, right? Those bias caps are crucial. Not putting the board back yet because I need to have access here to do the filter caps. And that will be next. All right, I'll show on this first one that I do. Now this amp has been sitting discharged for a couple weeks. Let's see if there's any residual voltage from the oft-mentioned voltage memory of capacitors. It's holding 0.002 volts. If I measure up in the air, I have 0.004 volts. Sometimes it fluctuates. Just check these others. There's no voltage stored on these caps. So I'm just going to disconnect the ground wire. Disconnect this red wire here. I'm taking a note of the amount of slack because I don't want to burn the leads, but I have enough slack there I could expose some fresh wire as necessary. Hope you're seeing everything. I can't really undo this right now. All right. Now that ground is of a concern to me because I can see corrosion on the nut. There's corrosion on this nut as well. So before I do anything else, I reach around and support the screw on the other side. It wasn't very tight either. I don't want to strain those wires. I can see all kinds of crusty things that were between the chassis and the grounding hardware. And crusty bits don't make for good solder joints, don't make for good conductivity, and the paint is making it hard to get. The paint that they applied to show if the nut had been, quote, tampered with, is making things a little bit difficult. Yeah, the screw is spinning on the other side. I've got to tilt things up to be able to get my screwdriver there, so let me pause this. I can't show this just because I'm not going to set up a different camera angle for 30 seconds worth of work. Okay, I got the screw loosened. Here's that nut and that lock washer, which is corroded. The screw just fell out, and there's corrosion on the chassis and on the ring of the ground terminal. So step one is go in there and see what comes up with isopropyl. Get a little bit of paper towel for that. Clean that part of the chassis there. That's all stuff. Some of it's that black paint, but some of it's just junk that was in that spot. And I want to clean the mating surfaces of that grounding ring. You can see the brown there. Hopefully you can see the brown there. That stuff that was in between bits of metal stuff that was making for a poor ground. So, I mean, changing filter caps is great. I highly recommend it every 15 years or so, especially on a high voltage amp. But it's only part of the puzzle. You've got to get the hardware clean and where the grounds are made clean. I'm cleaning that oxide off camera. And this brass nut, I'm going to clean off camera as well. I'm just squirting it with ISO and then smudging it with a paper towel. And that will get off loose paint. It'll get off dirt and everyday run-of-the-mill stuff. But then I want to get in here and give the ground ring and that bit of the chassis just a little bit of deoxit. Maybe I used a little too much, but when I look at the cost of a can of deoxit versus what's now a vintage Marshall 100-watt amp, I'll err on the side of protecting the amp. And that looks good. I've got clean metal all around. Look at these little fibers of paper towel out. All right, now that screw itself is fairly corroded. So I'm going to put it in a little WD-40 bath, and we will change the rest of the connections on that cap while it soaks. And I'll put this back together and redo that ground later. I just got to loosen the clamp on the side, which I can't really show you, but I think everyone who knows how to turn on a computer understands the basic principles of using a screwdriver, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. And it's corroded. I'll probably have to get in there with a wrench, so let me move things around. Okay. Had to remove those two EL34s to have access for the screwdriver, for the nut driver, to hold that nut in place. And they really make it difficult to do this on Marshalls because they're so close together, the cans and the clamps. If they'd have these out spaced by just another 1/8 of an inch, it'd be much easier. All right, this cap should just pull straight up. Sometimes you need to loosen it more than others. Depends on how much the clamp is dug into the body of the capacitor. Don't want the nut to come off because then it just takes longer to put back. Let's see if I press down here. Give myself some leverage. All right, old LCR from 1987. Actually, no, 89. It's an 89 amp, that's right. There's a little bit of corrosion on that. I'll just use ISO. I should buy stock in this stuff, except it's dirt cheap, but is a very handy solvent for most of the stuff we do. And it evaporates. Let's see if I can loosen this one. See, this clamp is actually physically touching this clamp. Sometimes on these old Marshalls, I've got to remove this screw and nut to get the clamp all the way out of the way to access this one. Let's see if that's the case here. Sometimes I can turn it without using the nut driver. You want to make sure that the screwdriver you use precisely fits the flathead. Otherwise, these brass flatheads get all torn up. Yep, I'm going to have to remove this. I can't get my nut driver in to secure that nut. I can get the socket from the other side. And on these, there are these Phillips heads, so this shouldn't be too difficult. That is a old, slightly corroded Posi-Drive. And while I do have a Posi-Drive screwdriver around here, let me see if I can just do the nut from the other side. I don't want to strip the Posi-Drive. I also don't want to take the time to dig out the other tool. Usually there's enough overlap between Posi-Drive and Phillips that it's not an issue, but when you get into corrosion and things where there's high torque, you have to watch yourself. If this hadn't had this nut on the other side as an option, I would have gone for the other tool. I think I just dropped a washer. It's all right. I do that a lot. I've got a little magnet thing for the floor. There it is. All right, so with this out of the way, now I can get this one loosened. You know, this is the kind of thing that when you write it up on the service record, people say it took you 2 hours to change 3 capacitors. Again, if Marshall had left another 1/8 inch gap between the caps, this would go a lot faster. It was cheap to build once. It was easy to build once, but to undo, and it varies by model, but sometimes it's a lot of fun. See, even though that's loose, that clamp is still tight. It's a spring. It remembers where it wants to be. So now I can flip this over and undo this one. I'm going to go ahead and do both these caps now, and we'll catch back up once these are back in place. If you want to know how to do that, play the video backwards. Going back in with the camera just a little bit early because I wanted to point out all this corrosion flaked off the ground point, which is this ground here. Just can't repeat this enough. While the ground scheme of a stock Marshall is maybe not optimal, try to do this without affecting that sticker. It sure works a lot better, at least when working as designed, without all this corrosion. 1 eternity later, all those grounds redone, new wire connections made, exposed some fresh wire, got a good little hook to it. The same thing can happen with the grounds for the cathodes on the output tubes. I will check that. They are generally much lower in current, so it's a little bit less of an issue, but bear it in mind. Now this board's been flopping back and forth a bit while I did all this, so before I put it back, I'm going to give an inspection for all the soldered connections, make sure nothing has come loose or slightly broken. Then put this back together, then get to the DI out nonsense, which doesn't sound very good. No one uses it, but while I'm in there, might as well make it nicer. So it'll be a nice example of a useless circuit. New CTS 5K pot, new Cliff jack there. Much nicer on the wiring. Everything's secure. Time to do some front panel stuff. A couple of things of possible interest. The washers in this era of Marshall have a rounded side and a flat side. If you put the flat side up against the chassis, it gets all gouged up like that. And they did it from the factory. I put the round side towards the chassis faceplate. It's just as secure electronically, mechanically, but it won't scar up the metal panel as much. And then I like to get them all equidistant. All the pots exactly the same, because they have washers on the back, which I'm going to adjust here, and washers on the front, and you can kind of move them around. I like to get them all pretty much just like you see here, so that they're almost all the way tight like that. And then I move the nut in back to get them all to that point, and then I'll go behind and give them all a final tightening. That way they will all end up the same distance sticking out of the chassis, so all the knobs will be on the same plane. It's not anything other than, I think it looks nice. And if you have an amp from this era and you pay to have a guy like me do a total recap, the damn thing should look as nice as possible when you get back, I think. I'll put the other nuts in place once I'm sure that this board doesn't have to be pulled out, but I've got the most crucial ones attached to the chassis for just right now. We put those power tubes in, flip this around, power it up, and see where we're at. So I'm going to set all the knobs where I expect them to be. Just kind of put them at noon for right now, etc., etc. So I did an initial power up and was filming it and everything. Everything was fine except as far as the initial power up goes, except there was a weird, awful sound. Then I realized I didn't have my camera in airplane mode, so it's still a little bit sensitive to noise and buzz. You can hear that in the background here. If I put the shielding plate on top, it gets a little bit better. There's still a higher noise floor than I'd like. Sometimes the stuff in the switching circuit on these split channel reverbs acts up a little bit. We'll investigate. But that's good, and my guitar is out of tune. Great. But the amp's working. So there is a hum present on the clean channel, and it's not related to the volume level of that channel. On the dirty channel, goes away, and that hum is not affected by environmental causes. So, I know it is not going to be one of the new capacitors I just put in, but they do their switching circuit in these amps, these 2210 split channel reverbs, by rectifying right here off the heater supply. And that can be noisy. And sometimes it can be a matter of just moving the filter wire, the heater wires around in the amp can make that stuff go away. It could also be proximity of grid connections to the heaters, like right here. I'll play around with that. It is a terrible amp as far as lead dress goes. And now that I know the electrolytics, the filter caps are all working right, I can get in here and troubleshoot these other issues. Because before I did this, the amp had so much hum in the background that it was hard to know what was caused by what. Noisy. That's not good. That shielded run is not very reliable. All right, so that is the effects return, introducing that hum. Microphonic cable, moving it makes that noise change. That cable needs to be replaced. I bet this cable needs to be replaced to the foot switch. A lot of this lead dress here can be neatened up quite a bit and steered away from the noisy bits. Like here, we have these green wires are grids. They carry AC signal. They're really sensitive to heater wires. This red wire right here, this black wire right here, that's almost touching here and running in parallel for links. Those are heater wires, which are giving us the power for this switching circuit. So I've got more work to do. It's why I didn't put the nuts on this front board all the way back together. But tomorrow is Mother's Day, and I've got to go do some stuff with my wife. So this will resume after a massive grocery store trip and some other stuff like that. But we've made good progress this morning, and I feel like we're in a much better place. That stuff will go away.